Have you noticed that politicians struggle to enact the things they run on? That regardless of who wins elections, lawmakers cannot pass whatever legislation they like. They find themselves bound by what is popular, or at least their sense of it. They can only enact legislation within a narrow set of ideas, and that range is called the Overton window. And on the Overton Window podcast, we look at issues around the country and talk to the people who change what is politically possible. Now, one person has a cure for much of society's problems, and that cure is to build more housing. Instead of making his argument in an academic paper, however, he put his argument in comic form. And so today we are joined by Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University and author of Build Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation, with artwork by Audie Bronzai. Bryan, welcome.
Fantastic to be here, James.
Why is building more homes a panacea?
Good question. Of course, not literally panacea, but there's a long list of problems that, in the book, I argue, actually can be greatly improved by just deregulating housing. Just to back up, housing is one of the most regulated industries in the United States. We basically treat developers like criminals. Anytime they want to build something, it's like, prove it's not going to lead to a total disaster. The result of this is that we really build a shockingly small amount of stuff in the United States. And strangely, it's especially in the areas where prices are highest that it's hardest to get permission. And therefore, if you happen to, for example, buy a home in San Francisco 50 years ago, you're a millionaire now. You didn't have to do anything. They just strangled the rest of the market and you got to take advantage of it. In terms of what kinds of problems I'm talking about, the really obvious one, obviously, to just
housing prices.
Yeah, just to be redundant, yes, is housing prices. Preventing developers from building housing prices means that housing prices go up. And since housing is a large share of the budget, this isn't just like making chewing gum expensive. It's a big deal when you make housing expensive. And then it winds up having a lot of other effects. So besides high housing prices, it makes a big dent just in overall living standards. So people spend about roughly 20% of their income on housing. So if you double that, you are drastically reducing living standards. It leads to a lot more inequality. Actually, when you look at the numbers, it turns out that a shockingly large share of the rise in inequality that usually is attributed to markets and capitalism just comes down to housing regulation. In particular, this famous result that capital share has been rising since World War II. Turns out that if you subtract out housing, then it's been going down. It's not some kind of weird thing where capital just builds on capital. Instead, it's one where, again, someone who luckily bought a home in San Francisco 50 years ago just gets to reap a giant windfall because regulators won't let competitors go and build more stuff. Housing regulation has reduced economic mobility because it used to be you could just move to a high-wage part of the country and raise your standard of living. But now, normally, the extra housing cost eats up more than all of the gains, so you're actually worse off for moving. And then I go over a lot of other things. Things as simple as when housing is expensive, people keep living with their parents. When they keep living with their parents, they delay marriage and have fewer kids. And that, in turn, compounds our fertility problem, which is not just about housing, of course, but it's a serious issue.
So check that out. There's one chapter in the book devoted exclusively to the socials that can be solved with more residences. So what needs to happen to get more residences?
So sorry, could you repeat that, James?
Oh, what needs to happen to build baby build?
The answer in the book comes down to everybody's got to read my book and believe it. So conveniently enough for me, but I mean, the regulations exist because people think the world would be a lot worse without them. And most of what I'm doing in the book is saying that's actually incorrect. It would be much better if we went and just let builders build what they wanted. Would everything be perfect? Of course not. Would there be problems? Yes. But I say the gains are just so much bigger than the problems. We should just go full speed ahead and stop listening to the complainers. I mean, partly what's going on is the complaints are absurdly exaggerated. People, when they hear about new construction, just let their imaginations run wild as, oh, this will be a complete disaster. It's like, or maybe it'll be 2% worse traffic. Mm-hmm. Is that a more realistic assessment of what's going to happen than at the end of the world? part of what's going on is people just deny that there is this connection between housing prices and construction. So, like, if you're that level, it's like, I don't know what I can do to convince you. I guess I could say, well, do you think that if we went and destroyed half the lemonade in the world, that the price of lemonade would stay the same? Like, what else would you do there? Right? But then another big factor, and this is one where if you think about it a bit, I think it pretty much has to be right. It's that when people think about new construction, they only think about what could go wrong. They don't think about what could go right. Even though when you look at the real world, you will see that people don't want to live in the middle of nowhere. They don't want to be away from all the people that cause problems. Instead, people usually want to live in places where other people are, which means, yeah, there's going to be noise and parking and traffic problems. But guess what? When you live around other people, there's also a lot more restaurants. There's also a lot more job opportunities. There's more kids for your kids to play with, on and on. Just the very fact that people pay a lot of money to live around other people is a strong sign that the positives of new construction outweigh the negatives. So instead of trying to go and stop you from building stuff, you should be rooting for it.
So I want listeners to note that the policies that we're talking about, we're relying on statistics, argument, abstract concepts, and even you're borrowing from a lot of the academic work on these issues, what housing and housing regulation is going to do. But these are terrible concepts to make a comic book out of. Like, how do you figure out how to tell stories through imagery on this really abstract concept?
I mean, honestly, I think that the comic book framework and the research are almost tailor-made for each other because so much of what the research is doing is pointing out how the world could be really different. And one of the great things that you can do in a comic book format is draw this alternate reality. That's a lot of the inspiration of the book. It's like, well, I could either write about how, well, we should have more skyscrapers because or you could just show a bunch of skyscrapers. It is quite shocking to me that when people go and mentally picture major cities, they usually just think of it as a forest of skyscrapers. And yet if you get up in a helicopter or look at photography from a helicopter, you'll see that even the supposedly most densely built cities actually have a lot of quite short buildings. So in the book, I've got pictures of that are illustrations that are drawn from actual photography of Central Park. Central Park, it's basically just a bunch of like 4 to 6 story buildings around this whole park. There's only a couple of skyscrapers. You could have hundreds of additional skyscrapers across the street from Central Park. San Francisco is even more extreme. You just look at it, really, like 5 to 10% of the city has skyscrapers, and the rest is just small buildings that hardly have anybody in them. If it were legal to go and buy up those houses, then they would almost certainly have been bought up by the hundreds and thousands of knocked over, and there would be giant new structures. And the price of living in San Francisco would be a fraction of what it now is. In terms of like where do you get visual ideas? I mean, a lot of it is reading the research and then just thinking, well, what images would actually really convey this? Part of it is, I start off by making myself a character in the story. That's really easy to do. And then it's like, all right, well, who would I be talking to? And then sometimes I'm talking to
why there's a villain in the story.
Yeah, but then sometimes it'll be more interesting. I was talking to a pig, and so the illustrator draws a pig, and so when you're thinking of visual ideas, often it's helpful. So we got lots of different kinds of mythology. We got fairy tales. We have movies, and all of this pop culture is out there. Very easy for most people to latch onto mentally as soon as you see the image. It has associations. So this is a lot of what I'm trying to do because the research is intrinsically fascinating, but it is not actually fascinating to read for almost anybody. There's almost no one who's like, oh, great, another NBR paper housing. I can't wait to sit down to this. And yet, if you really read it and digest the conclusions, that's what I say is, in fact, fascinating. And it's fascinating because you realize, well, it's visionary. There's a different world that is technologically totally feasible as soon as the paperwork goes through. It's just so hard to get the paperwork done to the satisfaction of the regulators.
Do you have a favorite sequence from the book?
Probably my favorite page, actually, is the one where I said, think fast, and it's, $1 trillion minus $1 billion is approximately equal to $1 trillion. And then right underneath there's a debate going on between a bear and a mouse. And the bear is saying, trillions of dollars of gains, but the mouse is beating him with all of these little arguments. And yeah, honestly, that's just the way it's been for me in so many debates, where you can have one really big ironclad argument that ought to win the debate for you, but a good debater basically can just go and give 10 picky points, each one of which, when you put a price tag on it, is, well, you suppose you're right. It still doesn't change the fact that my argument is more important than yours. But in the eyes of an audience, it's a totally different story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before the bear says, how am I losing to this guy? Yeah, that's me.
Before we dip into what the Overton window looks like on this issue, let's talk about the players pushing on the policies. I mean, as you know, the restrictionists tend to be existing residents, and the beneficiaries are potential residents who don't really have a say in the popular policy for the place that's making these restrictions. Now, this messes up the local incentives the political incentives at the local level, which is the level that provides the restrictions. So what does the Coalition for More Housing need in order to get better rules?
Yeah, good question. I'm glad that you said resident rather than owner. A lot of economists think that it's owners that are the supporters of regulation and tenants are against it, which is just false. Actually, normally both owners and tenants are in support of regulation. You're like, well, why? What did tenants gain? How do tenants gain from things being more expensive? And the answer is most people don't actually use standard economic models when they're thinking about what's going on. It's more of, what kind of community do I want to live in?
Sentiment.
How can things be made better? I think the first step is to realize, well, if it's not objective self-interest, then what is it? And I say it's basically what you call ideology or philosophy. It's not that people correctly perceive their objective interests and then strategically advance them. Rather, people have a philosophy which generally is very poorly thought out, and that's what they rely on. Also worth pointing out, by the way, that most people have no idea what's going on. It's not that most people that are residents in the area even are going to meetings or paying any attention. It's very much worth remembering it's a small number of activists who are the ones who exert an enormous amount of influence, and they are not people that represent the community in any broader sense. What really needs to be done? I think actually if people would just vote their objective self-interest, that would be a huge help. If you could just get them to do that. Because then all tenants would be against regulation. And then on top of that, though, there's actually a lot of owners who suffer from regulation too. So any owner who wants to upgrade suffers. If you're in a starter home and you want to move to a nicer home, do you want housing prices to double? Well, the value of the home you got doubles, but so does the value of the home you want to buy. That's no good. Furthermore, anyone who has adult children, they would like to live nearby. For them, regulation is at best a mixed bag. So it's not even that we had owners versus tenants. I think really what would be most helpful would just to get people to accept the very basic economics of what's going on, namely prices are high because it's hard to build. The way to make housing cheap is to make it abundant. And then just combine it with a more realistic sense of the net package of what development does. Just to say, look, if you really just wanted to avoid all problems, you'd live in the middle of nowhere. You don't want to do that. Why not? Because human beings and development bring a package of good and bad, and the package of all the good minus all the bad is still a positive. So economic literacy and just thinking in terms of numbers and just avoiding paranoia and hyperbole. I think if we get rid of these things, then this would make a huge difference to support.
So I think, and just thinking about where the Overton window is on this issue, I mean, it's clear that extraordinary restrictions are well within the Overton window. I mean, most places that are organized in municipalities have zoning, and the zoning says, basically, for most of the land, you can only build single-family houses. They have to be this far.
Zero development is in the Overton window in many places.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I was shocked. I was told in Boulder, Colorado, there's a big fire, 1,000 people lost their homes, and a couple of years later, they're still waiting to get permission to rebuild their houses.
Jeez.
Right? And I'm thinking, surely they would go and make an exception after a big fire that affects a lot of people.
Yeah.
No exceptions.
Well,
I'm going to do it.
And because zoning, housing codes, and all sorts of things have evolved over time, you can't just get, like, most of the housing that has already been built is now illegal because
yes,
you can't.
Which is why it's very common when you want to build a new structure to knock down everything but one wall and then get a permit to do an addition rather than knock down the whole thing and get a permit to do a totally new home. I've actually seen this in my neighborhood, the one wall that stays so that the easier rules apply. It's a crazy system.
And which also means that the developers that are trying to do something on this just have to either build single-family homes that meet all the regulations or be really creative in trying to avoid them, as you noted. So, there have been some changes in land use rules, zonings, building codes, and whatnot. So where is the other end of the window for extraordinary permissiveness?
A lot of it honestly just comes from American federalism, and different areas have different rules. So you'll see that there are some cities that build no skyscrapers and others that have some. And so all that is in the Overton window. If you just find the cities that are granting the most permits the most easily, well, so you got that. Other things that are within the Overton window that you might not have thought were possible are getting rid of single-family zoning. So at least for most purposes, California and Oregon have gotten rid of those. So it's possible to get rid of single-family zoning. And then finally, just to reduce the size of required lots. Just across the street from me here at George Mason, there is an amazing development, single-family homes, but the homes are about 6 feet apart. This is basically what every builder wants to build in high land price areas, because sure, people pay more money for more land, but they won't pay anywhere near as much as another homeowner that could actually get their own home on that very same land. And then finally, it's true that there are a bunch of parking rules that have gotten rid of, some minimum parking requirements, so that's within the Overton window too.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about this issue, I think it's extraordinary to see how unintended all these policies, the unintended consequences of all these policies. Zoning was just, look, we want orderly zoning. It wasn't, we never want any duplexes, multifamily housing, or anything like that in the area.
And if you go and read the early advocates of zoning, I'll just say I read them. They sound like reasonable people. They're like, well, like there's a race to go and build the tallest skyscraper so only your tenants have light. And if we could just go and have some rules to limit this rat race, wouldn't that be a good thing? And each time they have a specific complaint, you're like, oh yeah, well, I can see why people want to have a rule about that. But it is death by 1,000 cuts. And if you basically just go to society and say, anyone have any problem with anyone doing anything? And then it's like, yeah, I've got a problem. And it's like, everybody's got a problem. It's like, if you give every single person in a group the right to veto a restaurant, you're all going to starve. And that's kind of the way the housing regulation works.
Yeah. And the default for so many people is just to recommend eliminating it. So we've fought an issue against Airbnb in the state of Michigan. A lot of local governments have Airbnbs within their bounds, and the complaints are that this changes the character of the neighborhood, and the people who are renting are bad people who do bad things. And the answer is just enforce your nuisance laws, because bad behavior is already illegal in these areas.
But then we have to wait for someone to actually do something. Whereas with the laws, we stop problems before they ever start. And isn't that a way better way to handle everything, just to make sure nothing could even begin to go wrong? It's like, well, not really, because that also prevents any new thing from going right. And like when I'm with my kids, especially on vacation, they'll say, well, Dad, couldn't this go wrong? And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not worried about what could go wrong. I'm thinking about what could go right. We could have an amazing experience. Why don't we just go and try it? A world where you're always just vetoing things because you can't prove it will be perfect is a terrible world in the end.
How is a graphic novel going to change the political calculus on this issue?
Well, obviously, this graphic novel is going to be the most successful of the entire genre, and the world will be transformed. It will be translated to every spoken language. All people read it. It will become our new Bible. No, probably not. So I'm just one person. I don't imagine that I am capable of actually fundamentally changing policy. I can only be someone who assists. But I will say that I think this book has a much better chance of changing minds than almost any academic book on the topic, because, first of all, the audience is much broader. While the book can be read with profit by active housing researchers, it can also be enjoyed by 5-year-olds and everybody in between. By combining words and pictures, I think I can just make it a much more accessible format. It's a lot more entertaining, so people actually keep reading. And then also, words and pictures together really do convey more information. So I think not only do I get more minutes of reader's time, but I get more education per minute of the time they give me. So put that all together, and I feel really good about this book, because if someone gives me 90 minutes of their life, I think they really will never again see housing in the same light. This is not the topic that I've been working on for decades. I really got interested in this maybe 6 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. And then it's one where just started reading about it. And the more I knew about it, then I would look at any construction project and saying, oh, wow, impressed they got that approved, or I would look at it and say, well, obviously they didn't want to do that, but regulators made them go and put only one house per acre, and that was the best they could get away with. So I just started seeing so many different projects that could exist but don't. And really, the main point of this book is to show people a way better world that we could have, that is physically possible, technologically possible. It's just not currently legally possible.
Now, when I look at the political battle around this issue, I think something like this actually has a lot more chance to make an effort than a lot of other efforts, simply because you look at the political players on this, and you have residences with outspoken residents who hate development. Mm-hmm. There's not much else there, and so there's different venues that you can play. As you mentioned, that political calculus changes at the state level, but in order for things to change, you have to have people want it. You have to change sentiments. You have to have them at least understand this issue and feel good about it, so that if a state lawmaker wants to dabble in this area, wants to make it legal to build more and more types of housing, they feel like they'll get political benefits and not political costs. That what they want not only will benefit people, which I think you clearly argued that they will, but people will want it too, which radically change the political practice. These issues are they are brittle, as in it feels like the issue is stacked against you because so much these rules are so pervasive. Mm-hmm. But with just a little bit of public support, it cracks, it falls apart, and you get what you want. And so an attempt to change public sentiment can have a lot more effect than yelling at politicians who aren't going to change their minds.
Mm-hmm. Although, honestly, I would just try everything.
Yeah.
That's, a big part of it is that often what politicians are looking for is a chance to get some extra property taxes without having a bunch of protesters show up at a meeting. So, one of the main lessons that I got out of reading all this stuff is lobbying is really underrated. Without lobbying by the construction industry, we would just not have any new building at all. The reason why anything gets built is that construction firms go to government and say, come on, please, come on. You get a lot of property taxes. It'll be good. Be great. I'll be your friend. Most of the times they get rebuffed, but sometimes they actually say yes, and that's why new things get built. The construction industry, it's all based upon building new stuff, so they never want to just have the world end because then the construction industry disappears. They always need to be getting new permits for further construction. And it's really thanks to them that anything happens, actually.
Mm-hmm. Now, the governor here in Michigan, is promoting Build Baby Build, like she reiterates the title of your book, although she probably got it from someplace else. Yet her only policies that she's enacting are more state subsidies for targeted populations. What's the political what's got to change here? Because there's Build Baby Build, and so therefore let's just take more money from some people and hand it out to others. Instead of Build Baby Build, let's just let people meet the market.
Yeah, or especially it's look, strangling supply while pumping up demand is what got us to the current predicament in the first place. Mm-hmm. So no, stop trying to pump up demand. We don't need any more stuff where government pays for things. We need to go and allow people to go and actually build stuff so that there's more supply. That is a really hard sell, actually. It's much more palatable for government to show up as Santa Claus and say, oh, it's a shame that the housing's so expensive. Here's some money so you can afford it. It's like, well, doesn't that just mean that other people can't afford it unless you build more and you haven't done a thing about that? Really, for this to work, it does require at least a somewhat better understanding of economics than we got. I mean, just repeating the slogan of pumping up demand while strangling supply is a bad idea. Maybe a quarter of the population could get that if you just say it enough times with enough confidence. I'm happy to go and do it, and I bet you'll do it for me too, James, but we need more than us to do it. But yeah, otherwise it becomes another issue where politicians demagogue and they make things worse, but keep getting power. It's a tough situation.
So, I mean, just from reading your book, it sounds like you're somewhat dour on the issue, as in you see all the problems, you see all the struggles, but obviously you wouldn't write the book if there wasn't a little bit of optimism here as well, or wasn't a hard problem that can be solved, and at least some of it could be helped out by a new graphic novel. So how optimistic are you on this issue?
Let's see. There's, of course, two senses of optimism. The optimism, how much better could the world be? It could be so much better. There's so much room for improvement. How much better is it actually likely to get? Yeah, that's where I'm like 3 to 5% better in the next 20 years would be roughly my guess. I know that there's plenty of people saying, oh, we're going from one victory to another. It's like, yeah, but they're like small victories. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the fine print, often the deregulation is much milder than it might seem from the headline. I mean, honestly, when I go and write about issues, the first most important thing to me is what is possible? Is something much better possible? And then if it's not, it's like, all right, well, that's just the way of the world. On the other hand, if it's just, well, it's possible, but people don't like the idea, it's like, all right, well, that's something that's still pretty fun for me to write. Imagine that everyone was an anti-vaxxer. Like the vaccines were great. You could still write something saying, look, we could get rid of all these diseases if people just go and do this one simple thing. They probably won't, but it's important just to lay it down as fact that we could be saving hundreds of millions of lives.
Yeah.
So to me, that's a kind of optimism. Let me put it this way. The least optimistic person, in a way, is someone who just says the status quo is as good as things can possibly get. Some people say that person's the optimist, but to me, it's like, no, that person is the biggest pessimist. They're saying, we're at the max now? This is the maximum? No, this is not the maximum. This is very far from the maximum.
The best of all possible worlds is yet to come.
Yes.
So I want to tell listeners just an important thing, which is we've covered some of this issue, but we're covering how to change this issue, what graphic novels can do with this issue. And I know some of you, my dear listeners, are skeptical that we need more multifamily housing. We need to build up and build more. But I implore you, check out Brian's book, because one of the things he does quite carefully, is to try and respond to each and every one of those objections that you might have. Because some of them are very, they're understandable. They can make a lot of sense. There's some sentiments that ought to be addressed. So check out his book, Build Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulations, especially if you're skeptical of this issue. So check it out. And Brian, thank you for coming on, and good luck in your attempts to shift the Overton window.
Thank you very much, James. I'm much obliged.